This presentation describes the process of planning EMS training programs at an EMS agency. So what are some examples of EMS programs that require planning? The purpose of this slide is to really differentiate between planning an EMS course versus planning an entire EMS program, training program, because programs are on a much larger scale. Some examples include a field training program for new hires, a simulation training program, a training program for new equipment, an annual EMS conference, and maybe an entire annual continuing education program for paramedics. So those are all large programs versus individual courses. Some of the key points that I'm going to try to hit during this presentation are to describe the interactive model of program planning, to recognize areas in your own existing programs that need improvement, and to gain an appreciation for the importance of strategically managing the tasks, the people, and the politics that often accompany the program planning process. This presentation is really based primarily on two textbooks. The first one is Planning Programs for Adult Learners, written by Rosemary Caffarella and Sandra Daffron. The other textbook is Working the Planning Table by Ronald Cervero and Arthur Wilson. Okay, so the interactive model of program planning has 7 components to it that I'm going to go through in this presentation. Those 7 components include discerning context, building a base of support, identifying ideas and needs, establishing clear goals and objectives, going through a strategic instructional design process, creating a learning transfer plan, and creating and conducting an evaluation plan. Now, please keep in mind that I'm trying to emphasize the word components instead of steps. Even though I'm going to go through this presentation in a stepwise fashion, these 7 things are never really complete. You're constantly going back to each one of them, so they interact with one another. Once you get more information in one area, it may cause you to go back and change some of the things that you've done in the other area, or you may the information that you collected in one area is going to impact another area. So it's very interactive, and that's why it gets the name interactive model of program planning. That's also why I created it kind of on this pinwheel, so that you can see that there's not really a beginning and an end. It's an ongoing process. So let's discuss discerning context first. So when you discern the context, what I'm referring to is you're going to ask yourself questions about your program. You need to ask yourself things such as this: who are the stakeholders? And when I say stakeholders, I'm talking about not only the participants or the people that the program is going to serve, but who are some of the other stakeholders? Who has power over your program? Who's going to be involved in making limitations for your program? And should be involved in the decision-making processes. And when you think about all these stakeholders and you write them down, what are their expectations for this program? As the planner, it's easy to really focus on your own expectations for the program, but without incorporating and addressing the expectations of everyone else involved, it can create a lot of conflict and difficulty down the road. So in discerning context, we also it's helpful to think about what is the history of this program. So is there organizational culture that's going to impact the program? Do people expect things to be done a certain way? And when they're not, does that throw them for a loop? And if so, how are you going to address that within your program? And always also try to keep in mind and upfront and be honest with yourself about what are the limitations that you're going to face in this program. Are there budgetary constraints? Are there time constraints? Are there limitations in your learners that you're going to be incorporating into this program? The final program, and we know when you really sit and take time to evaluate all that information and think about it, you need to remember as the planner that the final program is often a negotiated product, meaning it's a blending of the interests of those involved in the planning process. So a large-scale program, when you're involving so many people, so many stakeholders, in order to pull that off successfully as a planner, you need to understand that your idea may while it may be an end goal, it needs to also be a negotiated product of all the stakeholders and people involved. And that is also why program planners need to have excellent people skills. They need to be politically savvy, and they need to definitely be very ethically grounded in their decisions. Base of support. So base of support, really there's two, I like to, well, there's organizational support as well, which I'm not going to discuss here, but I think the two forms of support that are going to impact EMS training programs the most at an agency are the participants and then some of the other stakeholders that may not be participating in the program, but they definitely have power over your program. So participants, let's give an example. So let's use an example of you're going to maybe plan a year-long CME program for the practicing paramedics at your agency. So your participants really are your paramedics. So how are you going to involve them? How are you going to gain their support? And I kind of gave it away. I think one of the easiest ways to gain support and maintain support is through active involvement. So get them involved and give them a voice. Give them a voice that matters in the planning process. So maybe before the program launches, involve them in the planning. You can create advisory committees possibly, or get their input during the needs assessment process. During the program, you can use them as instructors, train them so that they know what they're doing, involve them in the instructional process, listen to their feedback, and allow them to have some ability to make changes. Allow them to be involved in the evaluation process, whatever evaluation process that is, and then involve them in implementing some of the improvements as well. So those are just some examples, but the main point there is on your base of support, include your participants, gain their active involvement, and give them a voice that matters. For your other stakeholders, and then here I'm referring to kind of everybody else, and primarily other people that have power over your program. So that's generally going to be your managers, your supervisors, people that you need their support in order to make this program happen. For budgetary reasons, for operational reasons, whatever it may be. Because if you don't have their support, they can pull the plug on your program too. One of the best ways is to just keep them informed. Give them ongoing progress reports, whether that's through emails, whether that's through maybe a monthly scheduled meeting that you have. It depends on who the stakeholder is. And allow them opportunities to make some decisions. Keep in mind, of course, that these decisions that you propose for them to make, you have to be okay with whichever way they decide to go. Identifying ideas and needs. I like to think of ideas and needs, and this is a huge area for EMS training programs. It's very complex. I'm going to just sort of summarize it here. I probably will cover kind of a needs assessment process in some of my other areas of my website, but to keep it short here, needs and ideas are going to fall into one of two camps. They tend to either be perceived needs or unperceived needs. So perceived needs, generally speaking, we'll go back to that paramedic maybe 1 year long CME program for paramedics. Perceived needs are going to fall into what do the paramedics feel that they need more training on. You can gather this information through questionnaires, through interviews, through focus groups, through product reviews, and through informal interactions with the paramedics that are going to be involved in the program. So again, that's what do they feel they need more training on. Unperceived needs related more to quality assurance. So when we think of quality assurance, we think of chart audits. We think of regulatory agencies such as the National Registry and state regulatory agencies. We think of testing such as maybe your agency has annual skill testing that people have to do. A job analysis is looking at the individual jobs within your agency, so different provider levels, and breaking the jobs down into individual tasks. And from there, from those tasks, you can then establish benchmarks that are measurable, which again goes back to that quality assurance, and then you can build continuous quality improvement programs off of that. So that's unperceived needs. So these paramedics may not perceive that they need more training on innovation, for example, but it's going to be a need that is established through a process by the agency, either through benchmarks and whatever it may be. Establish clear goals and objectives. So based on the needs that you identified during your need assessment, you can then prioritize those needs for your program. And from those prioritized needs, you sit down either yourself as the planner or with maybe an advisory group that you've created to build your basis support and continue with your basis support. You sit down and you start to write your program goals. So when you think of program goals, you think of broad statements of purpose or intent for education and training programs. So in other words, what I mean by that is sit down with your group or yourself and ask yourself these questions. Why are we doing this program? What do we hope will change in the future? And why is this program worth doing? Seem like simple questions, but often those involved of planning educational programs forget this step. And without that clear sense of knowing yourself as the planner, why is this program important? What are we hoping to achieve here? Having that written down so you can always go back to it. It's almost like a mission statement. It's going back to what are we hoping to achieve here? You need a clear sense of that, because if you don't have a clear sense of that, writing objectives are going to be kind of hard. You're going to be lacking a sense of direction, because program objectives are clear statements of the specific results to be achieved that are in alignment with the program goals. In other words, objectives answer how the program will achieve the goals. Let me give you an example. My example is a new hire training program for EMTs. So these are new people coming into the agency that we need to train. A lot of information to cover. So one of the goals of the program might be to develop a standardized new hire training program for EMTs that will make them competent entry-level paramedics for their partners. This goal is arrived at by asking the question, what are we hoping to do here at this new hire training program? What do we want to achieve? What do we want these people to be able to do when they're done? And this is an answer. Now, the next step then is to sit down and think of objectives that answer how are we going to do that? So how are we going to achieve that? And these are just two examples, but one is to require that all new hire EMTs complete a 2-day driver training course. Because again, going back to that goal, we want them to function as entry-level partners for their paramedics. So they're going to need to know how to drive an ambulance. Another goal is to set up an annual Train the Trainer course for field training instructors. And the reason for that is because we go back and look at the goal again, and it says right in the goal is to develop a standardized new hire training program. In order to be standardized, they all need to know how to conduct the program when they get students in the program. Otherwise, if everybody's doing something different, then we lack that standardization that we set out to achieve. So that's an example of what I mean by program goals and objectives. These are not classroom or course goals and objectives. They're for an entire program. And based on those objectives, you can then build out instructional design for each of the individual courses. So next, after clear goals and objectives, we have instructional design. Like I mentioned, once you got those goals and objectives, then you can build out into the systematic instructional design process to address each of the objectives. I'm not going to go into depth with instructional design during this presentation because instructional design is covered on another area of my website. But to keep it brief, systematic instructional design is driven by well-written objectives. It includes content that matches the objectives. It includes instructional methods or methodologies that match the objectives. And again, and last but not least, the assessment and the evaluation processes also go back and match the objectives. Without following a systematic process of instructional design, planners could fall into common pitfalls, including maybe planning too much material for the time allotted. Or another example might be discounting the context in which the learning is to be applied. The next topic is learning transfer plan. Creating a learning transfer plan is an ongoing process to ensure that the proposed changes or program goals actually occur in the workplace. Planning for transfer of learning takes place before, during, and after the program occurs. And it is the job of the program planner to continually think about barriers to transfer and what steps need to be inserted into the planning process to overcome these barriers. I like to think of a transfer of learning plan as being like a wedding planner. Because if you're a wedding planner, you do a lot of upfront work. You talk to a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders involved, and you create this plan for what you believe to be the bomb-proof plan for the ideal wedding day. If you're a good planner, you're also going to think about all the things that could go wrong that would impede you from actually achieving your goal of the perfect wedding day. So you might think of things that could go wrong, such as maybe, well, what's going to happen if the bride gets nervous, or the grandmother has a medical emergency, or somebody drops the wedding cake. What are you going to do as the planner? It's your job to ensure that that end goal actually happens of the perfect wedding day. What can you do to either prevent those things from happening, or if they do happen, what are you going to do to make sure that those interferences don't derail your entire plan of achieving the goal? So obviously there's some big similarities to that example and being a program planner at an EMS agency for EMS training programs. As the planner for those type of training programs, you need to think about all the barriers that are going to prevent you from actually achieving your goals and making sure those goals actually occur in the workplace. Some examples of barriers that could be encountered in an EMS training program include lack of motivation from participants, lack of support from managers and supervisors, maybe the organizational culture or the workplace environment. So think about all those things that could get in the way of making your goals happen in the workplace, and then think about what you can either do to prevent those things from happening, or if they do happen during the course of your program, what can you do to prevent them from completely derailing your program. Last but not least is evaluation. So evaluation is a process for determining if the design and delivery of your program is effective and if outcomes have been achieved. Like a needs assessment, evaluation tends to fall into one of two camps. Either the data that you're collecting is going to be quantitative or it's going to be qualitative. What you decide to do depends primarily on the goals that you established for your program, your goals and your objectives. So how can you decide or determine or measure whether or not the goals and objectives for your program were successfully met? And there's some other things that go into evaluation as well, but that's really one of the big primary goals of an evaluation plan. Quantitative data tends to be test, pre-test, post-test. Those can be either written or they can be simulated or observations. But again, if you use simulation and observations, you need to have benchmark data because it's data-driven to determine whether or not goals have been met. Surveys also, but if you're using a survey, you need to create a way to make that survey objective and data-driven using things such as Likert scales. Qualitative information is also extremely valuable, but it's we don't think of numbers when we think of qualitative. We think of descriptions, descriptive data. It can be through interviews, focus groups, and surveys. Surveys in the qualitative camp could be short answers. So you're getting that word information and description. One of the most important things whenever you decide to choose for your evaluation is that you have a plan for incorporating the findings. So you collect all this data, but then what do you do with it? How are you going to make positive change and report the findings as well? So to wrap things up, I'm going to revisit those key points again. One of the primary key points that obviously we covered in this presentation, or I covered, is describing the interactive model of program planning. And like I mentioned, there are more steps in the interactive model. I focused on 7 of them, including discerning context, building basis support, identifying needs and ideas, writing goals and objectives, designing instruction, creating a learning transfer plan, and conducting program evaluations. My hope was that if you viewed this presentation, you would start to think about areas in your own programs that could be improved by more thoroughly addressing some or all of the steps of the interactive model of program planning. If you do have a specific program in mind that you would like to improve, I suggest reflecting and writing some notes down about why the program needs to be improved, and then view this presentation again and evaluate how the program is performing, or your program is performing, at each of the components of the interactive model. And from there, you may be able to, look at your notes and formalize an action plan for improvement. Last, I hope by viewing this presentation, you've gained a better appreciation for the importance a program planner has in managing people, tasks, and politics in order to be effective at your job. Thanks for listening. And if you have any other further questions related to this topic, please feel free to contact me. My contact information can be found on my homepage. Thank you again.